This week on Quadriga, 1914 to 2014, a century of history. They were events that changed the course of history. 2014 marks the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. 75 years ago, Europe was once again plunged into conflict as the armies of Nazi Germany marched into Poland and ignited World War II. And it's been 25 years since the most important event in recent German history, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the lifting of the Iron Curtain. They're some of the most defining events in modern history, but how are they connected, and what is their impact on modern-day Germany? Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Happy New Year and welcome to Quadriga. The fall of the Berlin Wall was famously referred to by one American political scientist in 1989 as the end of history. The notion that the end of the Cold War would usher in an era of eternal peace, to use Immanuel Kant's phrase, now looks a little utopian. Indeed, the world of 2014 is at least as turbulent as that of 1989. So turbulent that comparisons are warranted between the world of 2014 and that of 1914. And in preparing for the changes ahead of us, what can we learn from the successes and the disasters of the past century? That's what we want to talk about today on Quadriga with three people who follow events and developments in Germany and Europe very closely. Starting with Philipp Gessler. He works for the broadcaster Deutschlandradio, and he wrote his doctorate in history on the culture of memory. His fields of emphasis are religion and society. And I'm very pleased to welcome Leslie Collett. He's an American journalist and writer who's lived and worked in Berlin since 1968, reporting on Germany for media outlets such as the British newspaper The Observer, as well as the Financial Times. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Pascale Hugues to the program. She writes frequently on Franco-German relations. She began her career at the BBC World Service, and she subsequently wrote for the French paper Libération and the news magazine Le Point. Philipp Gessler, 2014, as we saw in that report, of course, a century since the beginning of World War I, 75 years since the beginning of World War II. Is it going to be a tough year for Germany as these events are commemorated?
Yes, surely. There will be a lot of remembrance, but in the end, the history showed off quite well for Germany. In the end, everything went out quite well. So we will look back a lot, I think, but in the end we will see that from these starting points of our history, let's say, at the moment we are in very happy times. Therefore, I think there will be a lot of remembrance, but also some views ahead.
Leslie Collett, you have experienced much of that turbulence, that transformation of Germany on a very personal level. You were here in Germany as a boy, then you returned as a reporter when there was still rubble in German cities. Tell us something about that transformation as you have witnessed it.
Well, the Germans that I experienced as a boy in 1949 were totally demoralized. They couldn't foresee that this country would ever really rise again to what it is, anything remotely like it is now. At the same time, they had also lost their memory. They were complaining a great deal about the suffering which they had gone through the Second World War. They were pacifists because of that. Not pacifists because of what this country had done in the way of starting the war, but simply because of the immense suffering which they felt that they had gone through. This all changed. A young generation in Germany came up which rejected those values of their elders and created basically the Germany we know today. Without them rising up in the 60s and 70s, it would be a different country today. And I think because of that, we can be very sure, I think, that Germany is on a path which is one of not only peace, but of good leadership in Europe.
Memory and identity, Pascal Hugues, something that you have written about a number of times in your books on Germany, France, and their relations with one another. How will France be commemorating these enormous events of this year, and what do they mean for the French identity?
Well, it's very different to Germany, of course. The First World War, when you have pictures of the end of the war, 1918, the Germans go back, they've lost the war, they go back home, it's a defeat, it's a tragedy, a lot have died. The French, a lot have died as well, but they walk on the boulevards in the big French cities, and it's a triumph. And if you walk through French cities, every French city has at least 5 or 6 streets, big streets or boulevards, which carries the name of a general in the French army in the First World War. Joffre, Foch, Pétain, not anymore, but there was a little hiccup. So the First World War is an extreme, and it's a founding mile of the French identity, something everybody's proud about. It's a legend. I mean, there was not one Christmas evening at home, Christmas supper, where you wouldn't talk, the uncle or the grandfather wouldn't talk about his First World War. The Second World War is a little bit complicated because we didn't really win. You can't say that. It was very abruptly finished and we collaborated. That it took us a lot of time in France and we are still working on this very, very gloomy and very difficult period of our history. But on the whole, it's going to be a good year of celebration. And I hope, because the French haven't done this work on their history that the Germans have done, I hope that there will be a lot of question arising as well about the Second World War and the commitment of the French government in the Nazi, I mean the collaboration. That's still, I think, in a lot of French families, a taboo subject.
Philipp Gessler, as I mentioned, you wrote your doctorate on the culture of memory. Tell us something about what that means for Germans today. Leslie Collett reminded us that there was a kind of collective amnesia in 1949, a great difficulty in many, many German families to look back at the past, to talk about responsibility or lack thereof. Has that changed? What does it mean for Germans today?
Well, first of all, the First World War was a little bit forgotten in the last decades. It's only in the last, let's say, 10 years that the remembrance are coming back, and it's only by historians because all the people who really seen it or survived it are dead now. Therefore, the most important or more important is the Second World War. I really do think, as Mr. Collins said, that there was an amnesia, there was a great fear to look back at the Second World War and at the Holocaust. And it took about one generation to overcome this fear to look back. And still there's a lot to be learned by the Second World War and by the Holocaust, but seen all together, I think Germany is quite in a good way. And maybe it's good now that we are able to look at the First World War as well again, because this was the starting point of this horrible 20th century with all the ideologies and all the mass murders that occurred there. Therefore, if we could learn something from the First World War, I think, for example, the very dangerous path that every country is going if it's having an arms race, for example, with another country. This is always very, very dangerous, and that's one of the things we can learn today to avoid this.
Historians are, in fact, rethinking some of the theories about the causality of the First World War. For decades, it was simply assumed that there, too, Germany was the perpetrator. Leslie Collett, do you think we are seeing a shift now in that interpretation? And if so, what kind of a difference might that make for Germans, if any at all?
Well, it's a bit late for in other words, to say that Germans are going to be influenced very much today by the cause of the First World War. But it definitely has come to that Germany is seen as, because of its links with Austro-Hungary, have been sucked into a war it really didn't want to enter in the first place. But on the other hand, the fact was that when it started, it was backed wholly by the population, as it was in France, as it was in England, as it was in the United States. Everybody backed their own side. There was very little resistance to the fact that war broke out, and I think that's what has changed today. In that you have a very reluctant population in the United States today, after a series of terrible mishaps, starting with Iraq, then going on to Afghanistan. The population is simply not in the mood anymore. It took a long time for this to happen. Germany, it went very quickly. The end of the Second World War was so disastrous for Germany that it's learned a lesson for hundreds of years, probably, if not thousands. Probably, someone once compared it with the Vikings. Once they had finished with their pillaging of Italy and Sicily and so on, and were certainly burned out for history. Now they're considered, the Scandinavians are considered peace-loving, and I think this is the legacy for Germany as well.
And also, I think you have to remember, at the eve of the First World War, this immense climate of nationalism, in not only in Germany but in France. For one of my books, I studied I read a lot of discours of talks from French generals and also newspapers, and the climate was incredibly. I mean, they would, even in official newspaper, you would never call the Germans, but the Boche, which is a very, very nasty nickname for the Germans, and you wouldn't expect that to be in the speech of a general. You know, you would maybe think it, but you would use normal diplomatic language. So you have to remember, and this has changed completely. I mean, especially between France and Germany. But you're right. I mean, in Germany, but in France, I think everybody has this memory as well, even if we didn't suffer as much, or if we weren't. But nobody wants a war anymore, and nobody is as nationalistic. You have the Front National, you have a few parties, but it's not as
well, precisely, and we say it couldn't ever happen again, but in fact we're seeing predictions, Philipp Gessler, that in the next European Parliament there could be up to 25% far-right extremist parties represented. Are we so sure that nationalism could not rear its head again in Europe?
No, nationalism was always in Europe and will be always there as long as we live, I think. But the difference to 1914 is that there's no really great cheers about war, as Mr. Collins and Pascal Hugues said. You might remember that even the intellectuals like Thomas Mann, for example, embraced the war and said this is a moment of purification, of clearness, of cleaning, of hope. And this is unthinkable today, I think, in Germany, and also not in France and in the US, I think.
My father, who grew up in Berlin, told me the story of his father and many of the others, every day moving pins on a map on the wall of the way the German front was developing in France at that time. It was just a part of daily life. It was incredible.
The disillusion was very quick. I mean, I got the Feldbrief from my grandfather, the postcard, letters from the fields, yeah, which he wrote in the German army, because we are Alsatians, and he fought in the German army in the First World War, yeah, and he was 18, and at the beginning he's very enthusiastic, yes, and very quickly he sort of whines like a little child, and he wants to go back to his mother, and he says, it doesn't matter who wins the war, I want it to stop.
Yeah. And the good thing about the end of the Second World War for Germany was also that the world has learned from the disaster of Versailles, if you like. Yeah. And Versailles, they really had very hard conditions for Germany, which were opposed on Germany. And after World War II, there was plans to grow up for the growth of the German economy, and therefore this was a lesson very well learned. So there isn't a feeling in Germany anymore that we have lost the war and we will have to have a revanche. No, that's.
Leslie Collett, of course, there was not complete unanimity on those plans to revitalize the German economy. Indeed, there was an early plan after World War II, Morgenthau plan, to actually reduce Germany to an agrarian society.
But that was quickly rejected.
Remind us, what was it that somehow convinced George Marshall to invent his famous plan to aid Europe, to aid a former enemy? Quite an astonishing move.
Well, partly it was, of course, the increasing rivalry with the Soviet Union. Already in the early post-war years, we could see that the United States and the Soviet Union were not going to agree about any line through Europe dividing Eastern and Western Europe. And from that lesson, I think, grew the recognition that, and Germany was going to be a key to this anyway, as the leading industrial country. Even in defeat, it was going to, it was inevitable that you had to help this country. And it was, I mean, some people say it was an economic decision which America knew would profit itself, because it had to have somebody to trade with. Otherwise, who are you going to deal with in Europe but economically prosperous countries? And the Marshall Plan is what kicked it all off, yeah.
Pascal Hugues, another absolutely defining element of the post-war order that developed on the ashes of World War II was, of course, the Franco-German Alliance. Also inconceivable to many people that these two former enemies could become such close friends. Now, Angela Merkel went to France just before Christmas, her very first state visit after she was sworn in for her third term as chancellor. But many people in Germany feel that today France is perhaps the sick man of Europe, so to speak. How strong is that Franco-German partnership now? And is it perhaps in danger of weakening more than at any point since we have known it since the Second World War?
Well, it's become much more complicated, because you have to remember, since the after the Second World War, it was very clear Germany was a political dwarf and an economic giant, and France was a middle economic giant, but a political leader. And so you had France was there and Germany was there. And since the unification, Germany has become much more confident, is much more at ease with its identity. It's proud of its economic successes, and France is declining. France is in a real crisis. I mean, the economy is not doing very well. We have identity problems which are massive, and which explains also the rise of the Front National. And so the balance has changed, and it's very difficult now to, I wouldn't say it's weakening, but it's more complicated. It has to be worked out. You have to find another modus of communicating and to accept. I think it's more, for me, it's more a French than a German problem. The French have to accept that Germany is not a dwarf anymore, that it's a partner on equal terms, and that's quite difficult for us.
You reminded us of the importance of the First World War for the French identity. Clearly, France still longs to be seen by itself and others as la grande nation. It's engages in military activities in Africa, almost still as a post-colonial power. To what degree is all of that nostalgia?
Well, you ask me, I've been living abroad for many, many years, so I haven't got a very French look. I look at it with distance, and I find it sometimes ludicrous. I mean, I'm used now to German politicians being very low-key, very unpatriotic, and when I hear Mr. Chirac, Mr. Mitterrand, I remember Chirac, when he was called into office, says, La France va redevenir le phare des peuples du monde. France has to become again the lighthouse of the world. I mean, no German political. It didn't mean it wasn't dangerous, but it's ludicrous. It's ridiculous. How can you know? And this pathos, this emphasis. You know that in human relationship as well, when somebody's doing a bit too much and very loud, and actually it's a sign of low self-esteem. And I think that French presidents, I mean, Hollande is a little bit better, but but look at Sarkozy. You know, all this wind and all these words and all this, you know, affirming that we are La France, and shows that we are not so self-confident as we pretend.
And what about Germany, Philipp Gessler? Germany, of course, commended by us here in this program, but also by many, many historians and philosophers throughout the world for its confrontation with history. The Germans have a special word for it, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the attempt after the Second World War to come to terms with the past and with the pain and suffering and sin, if you would, that Germany had perpetrated. Where does Germany stand today in terms of its own identity?
Well, I think it's getting a little bit better, if you like. Still, the past is very present in Germany in the Second World War and the Holocaust as well. But as you know, the reunification is now about 25 years ago. And this also had an impact that there's more discussion now about maybe the new role that Germany has to play in the world or in Europe. I'm not sure whether really the German politicians want to play this role. Do they really want to rule Europe? I don't think so. They would like to be a very strong and healthy nation, but do they want to play the ruling part? I don't think so. They would like to do it, I think, with France, and at the moment that's a little bit difficult. That's true. But seeing the l'amitié franco-allemande, the German-French friendship, I think it's very important to see that this has also grown from the ground. If there wouldn't be so many jumelage, connections between little villages in Germany and in France, this friendship wouldn't be so strong as it still is. So I'm very confident that this friendship will overcome the next decades and will be stronger in the last decades also.
As we were reminded by the report at the top of our program, Germany will also this year be commemorating the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall. It has a young generation coming to adulthood who were born after unification. So have the scars of the division entirely healed? Let's take a look.
November 9th, 1989. After months of protests, thousands of East Germans converged on checkpoints into West Berlin. In response, the communist leadership opened the border. The Berlin Wall had been breached. It marked the beginning of the end of the Iron Curtain. A quarter of a century on, only traces of the wall remain. But is the East-West divide really a thing of the past? East Germans aren't any different. There are more differences between North and South. I'm at home in Eastern Germany. The West is a foreign country to me. German reunification, a success story or still a work in progress?
Leslie Collett, how would you answer that last question? Is unification still a work in progress, or would you say that it is now very much simply a part of the fabric of normal German life?
It's, yeah, both, actually. Many problems remain, but the basic division has been overcome successfully, I think, because in many ways, Germany is it's definitely a more sane country than it was before the division. It's a more content country than it was then. It's more livable. It's in every way, yes, a better country to guide the rest of Europe. And I talk about this because the Franco-German Alliance seems to be faltering to such an extent that there is a need for German leadership. And it's being shown daily. I mean, after all, Frau Merkel has the gift of not making it look as if she is trying to lead Europe, but for want of any other leadership, she has to do it. And she's doing it very successfully. And she's not exactly loved in Greece and Spain, but they're learning the lessons slowly because their elites failed on them. That was the why they're in the situation they are in today. And until they repair that fault, things aren't going to get better permanently. And I think Germany can teach in its very modest way a lot to the rest of Europe, and maybe to also the rest of the world.
But the question is whether the rest of Europe, at least, Pascal Hugues, is really ready to see Germany take on that role. You mentioned France's own ambivalence about the shift in relative power. And certainly many people feel Germany continues to punch under its weight in terms of leadership, both in Europe and globally.
Well, Germany is in a very, very difficult position, because if it leads, everybody gets up and say, "Ooh, you know, the shadows of the past, they are authoritarian, they want to have it their ways." If they don't do anything, they're accused of being passive and not interested and not committed and shifting to a Sonderweg or, you know, alone. So it's very, very difficult. But I don't think, I mean, taking the French, I don't know in Britain, but the French find it very difficult when the Germans are leading. You know, if they lead, we can't lead as well, and it's a big problem at the moment. And if you see, I'm amazed at the campaign in Poland, in Greece, in France, when that you every third week you have a cartoon or a politician who compares Angela Merkel with Bismarck. That's already absurd, and with Hitler. And it's, you know, who has ever complained, Monsieur Hollande or Monsieur Sarkozy with Pétain? Nobody would dare, you know? And she says, Frau Merkel is so laid back, she says, you know, we live in a democracy. She let it, which I find remarkable, because it's an incredible insult. I mean, actually, it's impossible to say something like that. So I think it's more of a problem of us, of foreign countries than of Germany, that we are very... Yeah, we don't let them do.
But I would be very cautious that Germany could teach anything to the world. That's thinking really before the First World War, that am deutschen Wesen soll die Welt genesen, on the German spirit the whole world should be healed. I really don't think that Germany has to give so much lessons. It's a thinking of an old world, I think. The main
teach by example, not teach in the sense of, you know, wagging a finger and in that way.
But in the economy. In the economy, we don't. The French, Britain don't want. You know, you always talk about German economic successes. But do we want to learn from them culturally? Do we want? I mean, politically, there are so many other fields. But
my mention of the sense that Germany often punches under its weight, Philipp Gessler, of course, also very much connected to the German reluctance to become involved militarily in other countries. As I said, France going with alacrity to Mali when it's needed, something Germany is extremely reluctant to do. Do you think we will see that change going forward? And is that part of perhaps a necessary form of German leadership given our increasingly turbulent world?
Well, I'm not sure, because as you've seen in Afghanistan, where Germany is since 10 years now, this reluctance is crumbling down in the last years. And I'm not sure whether really the militarization of foreign policy is a good path to be followed. It might be that the German army has to go with allies, France or the US, to other hotspots or to other wars in the world, maybe also to Africa. But this isn't something that I would like to see. I think the foreign policy of the future must be more clever. And as you have seen in Afghanistan, after 10 years, the outcome is not very, very good in the end.
This is a recognition that most Germans do have, that it was the wrong thing to do, right?
Well, in the beginning, there was the feeling, I think, 10 years ago, it might be a good thing. But as, for example, Margot Käßmann, a leading figure of the Protestant church here in Germany, said, nothing is good in Afghanistan. She was heavily beaten by saying this. But if you ask some people, some Germans there who are for example, working there for helping organizations, they say, well, in the end, it wasn't so wrong what she said.
Yeah, I think the Germans increasingly take the attitude, if there has to be a fight, let them do it. Because
is that going to work in the world
No,
of the
it isn't
future?
going to work because
I asked at the outset of the program whether we are looking toward such turbulence ahead that we might well say 2014 represents the same kind of tectonic shift in the world order that we saw in 1914. 1914, of course, the end of the world order as it was known at the time, and the slow birth of a new one. Is that new one now coming to an end, Leslie Collett?
we don't know. That is, I mean, these tectonic shifts are said to be this and that, but can we be sure? I mean, just as the prediction that the wall, the end of the division of Europe, was going to herald a new era in history, we don't know what's going to happen in China, for instance. Do we know whether this increasingly daily to be seen drive for more democracy in China, where is that going to lead? Will we perhaps witness a new rise in turbulence in China because of this? A population which has to take things in its own grasp because the leaders refuse to give the democracy which they want. Well, what that could mean in turbulence in Asia, and what is the West going to do then? We can't interfere in internal Chinese relations 180 years after the Boxer War. What can we do?
What will be the relations between India and China? Yes. India also has 1.2 billion people here on Earth.
Would you say, from the experience that we saw in the past 100 years, Philipp Gessler, that a shift in power like the one we're seeing now, and that one that occurred in 1914, as the German Kaiserreich rose to power, eclipsing England economically, militarily, or at least becoming a true rival, associated with terrible violence at that time, must such a shift ahead of us also be accompanied by violence?
No, I don't think so, because the globalization of the world, of the economic sphere, is so strong that even China is in some ways very cautious compared with the abilities they have. China, for example, is more interested in good trading condition than in political power, it seems. And if this is true, and will be true in the last decades, I don't think that really 1914 could be compared with 2014. I think in a way our world is more safe than it was 100 years ago.
Pascal Hugues, that sense of searching for identity in France, that sense perhaps of potential decline, do you think that reflects a real decline for Europe as a whole in terms of its position in the world? Does the rise of new powers automatically mean the decline of the old ones?
Well, I'm very European and I'm very optimistic, so I will answer no. I think, coming back to the specific French problem, we have European elections soon, and I'm very frightened, because you know the danger that the Front National, the right extreme party, will score very well, and that's, you know, I can't look in the future like that. I find it difficult, but I can look in the next few months, and that's very frightening. That's very, very frightening, and I think France should tackle this problem, and I hope that the French voters will come to reason and not vote for the Front National. But France has changed a lot in the past 10, 20 years. For 20 years, it was nobody would say aloud that they vote Front National. Now everybody, I mean, it's a party which is accepted by everyone, and which is playing a very big role.
A sense of decline, of course, Leslie Collett, subjectively, even if it does not reflect perhaps absolute circumstances, but a subjective sense of decline is a powerful driver for extreme politics, is it not? And are we seeing some of that even in your own country, in the US?
I don't think so. At least under the present administration, there's more a feeling of helplessness, really. We're looking at a phenomenon which is worldwide. leaders today simply have less influence on the course of history than they used to. They're not molders of history anymore. They're kind of riding on a wave of history and not knowing where it's taking them, really. I would say that that feeling, some people might say that's dangerous because there is no one power anymore which can determine events such as you had after the Second World War. No superpower left, really. I don't see the United States as it may be still a superpower in military terms, but that doesn't mean it can really decide what is happening in the Middle East. As we can see, just a series of failures. Every intervention, every attempt to bring about peace there simply doesn't work.
Indeed, there's a theory of two U.S. political scientists. They refer to the world that's ahead of us as the G0 world, not G8, not G20, but basically a leaderless vacuum. Philipp Gessler, if that is the case, let's bring it back now again to Germany and Europe, their role in the world, and what we can learn out of the successes of the past century going forward. What would be the essential components that we need to be aware of as we look at how to navigate through this vacuum?
Well, I'm not sure whether there really is a vacuum. There's no vacuum in power, normally. Maybe the power has shifted to multilateral big companies. Maybe there now is the big power, and not with the politicians. The world is getting complicated, more complicated than it was after the Second World War. But in my point of view, that's just quite normal. In a way, we are going back to normality, that there are many players in the world, and if the politicians are not as powerful as they were at the beginning of the First World War, where it was also a failure of the political leaders, for example, the Emperor Wilhelm II was a disaster in politics. I think this could be quite good if more or less democracies or strong nations are leading and not some very important figures.
Pascale Huyghe told us she was an optimist. How do you see it when you look ahead? There's a wonderful German word called Zukunftspessimismus, which is basically the sense that everything ahead of us is necessarily going to be worse than what was in the past. How would you see it?
I think Nietzsche said, everybody who is pessimistic is just realistic. But that's not true. I'm also tending, like Pascale Huyghe, to be quite optimistic. I really can't see, apart from maybe the ecological problems we will face, that it will be more dangerous the decades ahead than we had in the decades before. The ideologies are gone, more or less. We are the awareness that we are living on a very small planet and that we have to work together because everything else won't work is rising everywhere. Therefore, maybe there's a danger with China and the military there, but it can't be foreseen. And if there's any democracy or democratic movement in China, it could be a big gain for the whole world, and so I'm optimistic.
Pascale, you have children, I know. When you look to the future, of course, we mothers, we often think about our children and what the world will be for them and how they will see the world. What would you say is different about the identity of your children than perhaps in generations past?
The world is bigger, is bigger. When I was the age of my children, I was very lucky because I could go to England. We had family in England, and that was so exotic. I came from Strasbourg, I went to England. Now they go to New Zealand, they go to Canada, they want to live maybe in America, and I find that great. And in this Franco-German, everybody says, well, they don't learn German anymore, the French don't learn German, the German don't learn French. Yes, but they learn English, they learn Spanish, they learn maybe Chinese or Arabic, and I find it it's a little bit, you have to have a good sense of place to go very far away like that. But it's great that the world is so often, and I think you have to push them out and to make them inquisitive. And you see, I'm an optimistic.
Leslie, call it this word that I mentioned, Zukunftspessimismus, pessimism about the future, often said to be something that older people are somewhat more susceptible to. When you look toward the future on the basis of the extreme turbulence that you have witnessed yourself in the years that you have been in Europe, what is your expectation and how optimistic or pessimistic are you?
Well, basically, I am optimistic, particularly with hindsight. As you say, the past was definitely not exactly a blessing for Europe, and things are on the right track, I think. It's going to be a hard slog, as they say. It's not going to be easy to overcome the differences in economic growth in Northern Europe and Southern Europe. Those are all problems which are going to take years to surmount. But I think in the end, Europe will come out and surprise the rest of the world. The critics in some parts of the world have always pointed to Europe and have said it's a declining, decaying continent. I don't see much decay in it. It's vibrant, it's changing. Yes, there are these right-wing movements, but there are ultra-conservative movements everywhere who want to go back to the past. I think Europe is definitely going to surprise us all.
Many thanks. Optimistic last words for an optimistic New Year's program. I'm very grateful to all of you for being with us and to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon and Happy New Year.